Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and today I want to start somewhere that I think every single competitive rider will recognize immediately. It's somewhere between midnight and 3 in the morning. You wake with that particular full body alertness that feels nothing like normal sleep. Your heart is already going. Your stomach is doing something unpleasant. The show is tomorrow or the day after, and whatever preparation you've done, whatever test you know by heart, whatever reassurances you gave yourself before you went to sleep, none of it feels accessible right now. What feels very accessible is a vivid and detailed mental simulation of everything that might go wrong. If you are smiling right now, or nodding, or feeling slightly seen, welcome. You are in excellent company. This experience is so universal among competitive riders that it barely gets remarked upon anymore. It is just part of the deal, the price of caring, the thing you push through on the way to the showgrounds. What I want to offer today, though, is something that I genuinely wish every rider had access to much earlier in their competitive life. Because that 3 in the morning heart pounding is not a psychological weakness. It is not a failure of mental toughness. It is not evidence that you are not ready or not cut out for this or too emotionally sensitive for competition. It is a biological event. Your nervous system is doing exactly what millions of years of evolution designed it to do, with impressive precision in a situation for which it was not designed at all. And understanding the difference between those two things, what your nervous system is doing versus why it is doing it here, may be the single most liberating piece of information most anxious riders never receive. I also want to say at the outset that today's episode is for two audiences. If you are a rider, this episode is about your experience and what the biology behind it actually means for how you prepare and how you compete. And if you are a trainer or instructor, there is a section later in this episode made specifically for you because the neuroscience of show nerves has some genuinely practical implications for how training environments either help or hinder the riders in your care. I think you will find it useful. So let's start with the biology, and I promise this will feel relevant very quickly. Deep in the brain, roughly almond shaped, sits a structure called the amygdala. In functional terms, it is the brain's threat detection system, a rapid, automatic processor that scans incoming information, sensory, cognitive, social, for signals of potential danger, and initiates the body's defensive response before conscious awareness has a chance to weigh in. The amygdala does not wait to be asked. It does not consult your opinion about whether the perceived threat is real or proportionate. It activates, the body responds, and your awareness arrives afterward to find the racing heart already well underway. What research has clarified in recent decades, and what I find genuinely fascinating about this, is that the amygdala's threat detection system is not limited to physical dangers. It responds with equivalent urgency to social and evaluative threats, peer rejection, critical feedback, potential loss of status, public failure. In competitive equestrian settings, the threat signals are, if you think about it, actually quite abundant. The judge's box, the audience, the trainer watching from the rail, the other competitors in the warm-up ring, the score sheet that will exist in the public record. Each of these is processed below conscious threshold as a potential source of harm, and the amygdala responds accordingly because that is precisely its job. Research on the connection between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, the higher, more reasoning part of the brain, shows that whether these signals are ultimately experienced as manageable or overwhelming depends significantly on how well the prefrontal regulatory systems can modulate the initial amygdala response. In plain terms, the alarm goes off automatically, and then the higher brain either talks it down or it doesn't. Elite performers are not people who don't experience the alarm. They are, broadly, people who have developed more reliable systems for talking it down, which means the anxiety itself is not the problem, and this is worth sitting with. Developing better modulation of what the alarm produces is the work. That is a very different and much more manageable assignment. One reason it feels essentially impossible to simply decide not to be nervous is that the threat appraisal happens faster than conscious thought. Research suggests the brain can begin activating defensive physiological responses within milliseconds of encountering a threat cue, well before the slower reasoning systems have had time to evaluate whether the threat is real. You don't decide to become anxious. By the time you notice the anxiety, your body is already responding to it. That is not a character flaw, it is a timing issue, and it matters because it explains why telling yourself to calm down tends to have limited effect when you are already activated. The activation happened before the thinking did. So, what exactly happens once the amygdala fires? There are two parallel biological cascades that together produce what physiologists have called the fight or flight response. The first is fast. Within seconds, adrenaline is released into the bloodstream. The second is slower but more sustained. Cortisol, a steroid hormone, rises over minutes to hours and can remain elevated long after the initial trigger. Together, these two hormones produce the full physiological profile most riders know well: racing heart, shallow breathing, muscle tension, digestive disruption, that heightened, almost electric sensitivity to everything around you. Here is the simplest way to think about it. Adrenaline is the alarm bell. Cortisol is the sustained emergency mode that follows. Adrenaline hits hard and fast, producing those immediate physical symptoms. Cortisol then maintains the elevated state, which explains beautifully why competition anxiety doesn't simply peak and resolve. It persists, waxes and wanes, and returns unpredictably over the hours or days surrounding an event. You wake at 3 in the morning because cortisol is doing exactly what it was designed to do. And here is something important and genuinely counterintuitive. Moderate, time limited elevations of both hormones are actually adaptive. They sharpen attention, mobilize energy, support rapid decision making, and prepare the body for effortful action. Up to a point, show nerves are not working against you, they are working for you. The problem arises when the activation is too intense, too prolonged, or inadequately resolved. The issue is not the alarm system itself, it is the volume dial. Here is where the biology gets specifically interesting for riders. The physiological effects of that activated fight or flight state are precisely calibrated for the situation they evolved to handle: a physical threat requiring rapid, forceful movement. Blood diverts from non essential systems, including the prefrontal cortex, toward the large muscle groups needed for running or fighting. Heart rate increases, breathing rate increases, muscle tension rises throughout the body. For a rider trying to execute a dressage test, a jumping course, or a reining pattern, almost every single one of those adaptations is, rather unfortunately, counterproductive. The prefrontal cortex, whose activity is being downregulated, is the seat of the planning, flexible decision making, and error monitoring that competition demands. The muscle tension that the sympathetic system helpfully provides throughout the body is exactly the kind of bracing and gripping that disrupts the relaxed, following seat that effective riding requires. The increased sensitivity to threat cues makes the rider hypervigilant to the judge's position and the crowd's movements rather than attuned to the horse's subtle signals beneath her. Research on sympathetic activation and fine motor performance is quite specific here. Acute sympathetic activation alters how muscles contract, favoring faster, more forceful contractions over the stable, finely graded force production that skilled riding requires. The body under acute stress is physically configured for a different task than the one the rider is trying to perform. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. It is a measurable neuromuscular reality. And I find that genuinely reassuring, actually, because it makes the question of why your hand suddenly went stiff at the gate considerably easier to answer. It wasn't you failing, it was your biology doing something very specific. Now, I want to introduce a concept that I think is particularly relevant to amateur equestrians specifically. It is called allostatic load, and the simplest way to understand it is this: A single stress response, well executed and fully resolved, costs the body relatively little. The alarm sounds, the hormones mobilize, the situation is managed, and the system returns to baseline. That is the adaptive design, and it works beautifully. But what happens when stress responses come frequently? When each one doesn't fully resolve before the next begins? When the baseline gradually shifts upward? Allostatic load is what researchers call the cumulative biological cost of chronic or repeated stress that cannot be adequately recovered from. For the amateur rider navigating a full professional and domestic life alongside her riding, this concept lands with some weight. Show nerves don't arrive in isolation. They arrive in a body that may already be carrying the cortisol burden of workplace pressure, family demands, insufficient sleep, and the cognitive exhaustion of constant context switching. Research on cortisol dynamics suggests that repeated stress activation without adequate recovery can produce progressively impaired capacity to downregulate the stress response, meaning subsequent stressors produce larger and more prolonged cortisol elevations. The rider who arrives at a competition after a difficult work week, having slept poorly for 3 nights, is not experiencing the same biology as a rider who arrives rested and regulated. She is operating in a system already primed toward threat response, with less regulatory capacity available to modulate it. Understanding this shifts the conversation, gently but importantly, from "why can't I control myself" to "what does this body actually need" before I ask it to perform. Here is the evolutionary piece that I find genuinely reframing, and I want to spend a moment on it because I think it is one of the more useful things a rider can carry into a competition. The fight or flight response evolved over millions of years to handle a specific problem: how to rapidly mobilize the body for survival when physical danger is detected. What researchers studying anxiety through an evolutionary lens point out is that the same basic neural architecture that handled predator avoidance also handled social threat, because in ancestral environments, social exclusion carried genuine survival consequences. Being cast out from the group could mean death. The problem, which these researchers describe as evolutionary mismatch, is that this ancient system is now operating in environments for which it was not designed. The dressage judge is not a predator. Riding a suboptimal test will not result in exclusion from the social group. The auditors in the gallery are not assessing your fitness to survive the coming winter. And yet, the amygdala's threat detection system, tuned over millions of years to err generously on the side of caution, treats these evaluative cues as if they carry survival level stakes. A system that generates many false alarms but never misses a real threat is, evolutionarily, far safer than a more discriminating system that occasionally fails to respond. So the false alarm rate in modern performance contexts is extremely high, and this is actually by design. For equestrians, this reframes the experience of show nerves in a way that I find both accurate and genuinely relieving. Your body is not malfunctioning when it produces a stress response at a competition. It is executing a beautifully designed program that happens to be running in the wrong context. The anxiety is not evidence of weakness, inadequate preparation, or psychological fragility. It is evidence of a nervous system doing its job with characteristic thoroughness, regardless of whether the threat is real. There is something almost tender about that when you think about it. Your nervous system is trying to protect you. It just hasn't gotten the memo about dressage arenas. I also want to gently acknowledge something here for the riders who have spent years in equestrian environments where the message, spoken or unspoken, has been that they are not quite legitimate, not quite serious enough, not quite professional enough to fully belong. Research on chronic adverse social environments suggests they can, over time, lower the threshold for amygdala reactivity to evaluative threat cues, essentially calibrating the nervous system toward higher sensitivity. A rider who has spent years in environments where her status as a serious rider has been implicitly questioned may arrive at a competition with a nervous system already sensitized to exactly the kind of evaluative threat those environments represent. The intensity of her show nerves is not simply a function of her current mental state. It is also a function of what her nervous system has learned from years of accumulated experience. Bodies have histories, nervous systems remember. And understanding that is not self pity, it is information. Now, let me bring in a distinction from the research that I think is one of the most practically useful frameworks for competition preparation. Researchers have identified two meaningfully different states that can accompany the same level of physiological arousal. They call them the challenge state and the threat state. Both involve elevated heart rate, increased blood flow, and mobilized energy. But they differ in cardiovascular efficiency, hormone profile, and cognitive availability in ways that produce meaningfully different performance outcomes. A challenge state occurs when the person's appraisal of the situation concludes that their available resources, preparation, skill, experience, support are roughly sufficient to meet the demands. The cardiovascular response in this state tends to be efficient. Blood is flowing where it needs to go. Cognitively, the person tends toward approach motivation, better attentional flexibility, and more adaptive decision making under pressure. This is the state where riding feels alive and responsive. A threat state occurs when the appraisal concludes that demands exceed available resources. The cardiovascular profile shifts less favorably. Cortisol is higher. Cognitively, the person tends toward avoidance, narrowed attention, and the kind of explicit motor monitoring that disrupts automatic skill execution. This is the state where the rider is thinking about every body part simultaneously and nothing is working. Here's the beautiful and genuinely hopeful piece. The research suggests that the distinction between these two states is determined not by the level of arousal itself, but by the interpretation of that arousal. Specifically, whether the person appraises the situation as one they have sufficient resources to navigate. The same racing heart and heightened alertness can produce a challenge state or a threat state depending on the cognitive frame around them, and that frame is, within limits, genuinely influenceable. Research on arousal reappraisal, the practice of deliberately interpreting physiological activation as facilitative rather than debilitative, shows consistent effects on performance outcomes across evaluative contexts. Saying, I am excited rather than I am anxious, is not wishful thinking if both describe the same physiological state. According to the research, it is a meaningful biological reorientation with measurable consequences. That is a small thing that is not actually small at all. And now I want to talk about the piece of this that has no parallel in any other athletic discipline: the horse. The horse is not equipment. He is a living physiological partner with his own nervous system, his own threat appraisal responses, and his own remarkable capacity for both co-regulation and co-dysregulation. Research on physiological synchrony between paired individuals shows that in emotionally charged cooperative contexts, autonomic systems tend to align. One partner's heart rate, breathing, and arousal state influences the others. Human animal research adds that horses are specifically sensitive to human physiological states, with heart rate, breathing, and muscle tension transmitted through the reins, the seat, and the proximity of the rider's body. In practical terms, a rider in a threat state is communicating that state to her horse through every physical point of contact: the gripping hands, the shallow breathing, the braced core. The horse, who has evolved over millions of years to detect and respond to the nervous system states of the animals around him, notices, and in many cases responds in kind. The horse becomes more tense, more reactive, more difficult to ride. The difficulty of the ride then increases the rider's threat appraisal, which deepens the stress response, which the horse responds to further. The downward spiral of a difficult warm up ring often has considerably less to do with the technical preparation of either partner than with this mutual physiological amplification. The same mechanism run in the opposite direction explains why a calm horse can help regulate an anxious rider, and why a calm, regulated rider can genuinely settle an anxious horse. The physiological attunement mechanism operates in both directions. A calm, experienced horse who finds the show atmosphere unremarkable provides something neurobiologically real to the anxious amateur who sits on him. And the rider, who has learned to regulate her own nervous system before entering the arena, provides something neurobiologically real to the horse beneath her. Competition preparation, understood through this lens, includes the nervous system state both partners bring to the gate. Nervous system regulation is, in a very real and research supported sense, a horsemanship skill. Now, I want to speak directly to the trainers and instructors who are listening because I think the neurobiology of show nerves has some specific and practical implications for how you work with amateur clients, and I want to be concrete rather than vague about it. When an amateur rider's performance visibly deteriorates in the warm up ring or at a clinic, the instinct is usually to address what is happening technically. Her position shifted, her timing was off, she got in the horse's way. What the neurobiology invites us to consider is that the more fundamental explanation is frequently physiological. Sustained sympathetic activation has measurably altered her neuromuscular function in ways that specifically favor fast, forceful contractions over the stable, finely graded force production that skilled riding requires. Her body is physically configured, at that moment, for a different task than the one you are asking her to perform. Addressing her hands while her nervous system is in a threat state is addressing a symptom of the state, not the state itself. The more consequential intervention is recognizing the appraisal dynamic underneath it, whether the rider is in a challenge state, where she believes her resources are roughly sufficient to meet the demands, or a threat state, where she believes they are not. The research suggests that the difference between these two states is determined not by arousal level, but by cognitive appraisal, and that appraisal is influenced quite significantly by the training environment. A trainer who consistently communicates that the demands of the session are calibrated to what the rider can currently handle, who frames difficulty as developmental information rather than exposure of inadequacy, and who recognizes that the amateur rider may be arriving with an already elevated cortisol load from the week that preceded the lesson, is actively shaping the appraisal conditions that determine whether the rider's arousal works for her or against her. The allostatic load piece matters for lesson structure too. The amateur who competes after a difficult work week is not the same biological organism as the one who rides in a regular Tuesday lesson. Recognizing that reality and adjusting expectations and approach accordingly is not lowering the standard. It is working thoughtfully with the actual physiology in front of you. And always, always remember the horse. Whatever physiological state the rider carries into the arena, she is transmitting it through every physical point of contact. Helping the amateur rider regulate before she asks anything of the horse is not soft preparation. According to the research, it is the foundational preparation. Here is what I want every rider to carry away from today. The show nerves you feel the night before a competition, and in the trailer, and in the warm-up ring, and at the gate, are not a sign that something is wrong with you. They are a sign that your nervous system is working. The amygdala detected a situation with evaluative and social stakes and initiated the biological response that evolution provided for exactly that situation. The adrenaline mobilized your energy, the cortisol maintained your alert state. The whole cascade ran precisely as designed in a body that was trying to take care of you. The mismatch, the thing that can turn adaptive arousal into performance interference, is not in your character. It is in the gap between the environment the response evolved for and the environment you are actually in. That gap cannot be eliminated, but it can be understood. And understanding it changes the psychological relationship you have with the response. The rider who knows why her hands are shaking has a different relationship with her shaking hands than the rider who interprets them as evidence of inadequacy. The first has information, the second has a verdict. That is not a small distinction. It is, in many ways, the foundation on which every regulation skill rests. You cannot regulate a system you are busy being ashamed of, and you have nothing to be ashamed of. If today's episode resonated with you, if the idea that show nerves are a biological event rather than a personal failing gives you something genuinely useful to work with, I want to point you toward a book that goes into all of this in considerably more depth. It is called The Amateur's Edge, and it is available now on Amazon. It is a full research grounded examination of the psychology and neuroscience of equestrian performance, written for riders who are serious about their craft and for the trainers and instructors who work alongside them. It covers everything from today's episode and much more: the complete neurobiology of performance under pressure, the specific mechanisms of confidence and self belief, the cognitive and physiological realities of competition preparation, all grounded in peer reviewed research and translated into something a rider can actually use. Search The Amateur's Edge on Amazon. Thank you so much for spending this time here today. Whether you are a rider sitting with this at 3 in the morning or a trainer thinking about what is happening in your client's nervous system before you correct her position, I genuinely hope this gave you something real and warm to hold on to. Until next time, keep riding, keep thinking, and I'll see you on the other side.